Hello class. The purpose of this video is for me to provide you with my own kind of interpretation of the words that you will be defining in your own words. So you can use some of what I'm saying in your interpretation of these definitions. So first off, evolution. When you're asked to think about evolution, you shouldn't necessarily think about the definition. You should try and think about examples of evolution in your head, maybe from the videos that you've watched previously or from things that we're going to be learning about in the future. But the basic idea of evolution is that there is an extremely diverse amount of living things on Earth. And if we trace back where they came from, generation to generation, year to year, millennia to millennia, eventually we find that all of these existing creatures have one common ancestor. And that one common ancestor produced offspring that changed a little bit and became more complicated. And then the strongest of those, or the most able of those to reproduce, survive and pass on their genes. An ecosystem is a biological or living community of organisms that interact with each other in a particular area or in a particular location or environment. An environment is the surroundings and the conditions, the weather, the climate in which organisms exist in a particular area. Bottlenecking is the concept that there's a particular amount of organisms existing, a particular amount of a species existing in a certain area, and for some reason, whether it be random or whether it be a disease or some type of mass killing, that the population reduces in size dramatically, which also reduces variation, which is also the idea for differences, reduces differences in a population. Genetics or genes are the information that makes an organism what it is. So the idea is that we have specific genes, or organisms have a specific gene, and those genes tell the organism exactly what it should look like, how it should function, how it should reproduce, what digestion looks like, all these particular functions, and the visual aspect of an organism, how it should be and how it should exist. DNA is the building block of life in the sense of it provides a cell with the information for how to function. So DNA is just this information code that tells a cell what to do. And on the grand scheme of things, all of the DNA in an organism makes up why the organism looks the way it does and how it exists. So DNA and genetics are very, very similar. A mutation is a random change to DNA, and this can be caused by a DNA copying error or an environmental factor like cigarette smoke, radiation, and chemicals. A generation is a group of organisms in a species that live in the same time. So that's a generation. So human generations are about 20 years, meaning that it's the offspring are about a 20-year difference away from each other, while ants are in a generation of like literally weeks or even days. Reproduction just means to make more of oneself, either by asexual, which would be a almost nearly exact replica, or sexual reproduction, where two organisms in a species come together to produce offspring and combine their DNA. Always during reproduction, there is some copying error, which means that there is some form of mutation for every time there's a reproduction which makes variation. A species, the main idea behind a species is that it's a group of organisms that are able to reproduce with one another, all right? So if a group of organisms can reproduce with one another, they are the same species. If they cannot reproduce with one another, they are not the same species. It is not just limited to this, but a species, so like a tiger and a lion. they can reproduce together. But its offspring is then unable to reproduce most of the time. So that's why tigers and lions are not the same species. A population in biology is a group of a species in a particular area. So population, so like let's say squirrels in New York. Squirrels in New York are in the same population. But then if you cross over the Mississippi River, right? Or if you cross maybe even over the Hudson River in the east and the west side of New York, you'll have different populations of squirrel that cannot interbreed with each other. So they are evolving separately and may become different species. Variation just means differences within a population, right? So differences within a species. And variation is caused by the genes you inherit from your parents, as well as the mutations that occur from the genes that you inherit. So always going to be some variation between all things. Offspring. So offspring are just the children of an organism. Natural selection is going to be the driving force, or one of the major driving forces through which populations or living things are forced to change. So a big idea behind natural selection is that nature is diverse, right? So there is a variety of different types of organisms within a species. So not all wolves are exactly the same. There's variation. Natural selection is the thing that is going to determine whether an organism survives in order to reproduce or if it does not. And if it survives in order to reproduce, how much does it reproduce, and how much of those genes are then spread through the population, which leads to evolution. All right?